I want to welcome you to the Clatsop County Regional Housing Task Force meeting on this beautiful, sunny sort of Wednesday afternoon in beautiful uptown Seaside. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go around the room and we're going to introduce ourselves and tell us where we're from. We're going to start on the far side over there.
Hi, everyone. Alyssa Gertler, Clatsop County Housing Manager.
Paulina Cockrum, Gerhart, City Council.
Barb Knopf, Mayor, County Beach.
Ian Wright, Mayor, Seaside.
Jeff Flory, Community Development Director, Seaside.
Jeff Adams, Planning Director, Warrenton.
Steve Sokolowski from the city of Cannon Beach.
Chip Ritz, North Coast Housing Solutions.
I'm Jay Blake. I'm the planning manager for Clatsop County for 2.5 more days. All right, we have a couple in the back. Let's start over here.
Tiffany Taylor, City of Astoria.
Yep.
John Roberts, City of Astoria.
Rep Chavez, District Rep.
All right, and we have 2 latecomers, and so they have to actually sing their introduction.
The last thing you want to happen.
No, all right, let's introduce yourself and where are you from?
Paul Mitchell, Commissioner, City of Warrenton.
Jared Karnofsky, Vice President of Ancillary and Support Services, Columbia Memorial Hospital.
All right, now let's go up to the top corner. We're going to have Gil introduce himself, then we'll come back to you, Gil.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gil Kelly. I guess I'm today's presenter. And I hail from the upper Hood River Valley in Oregon.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
Kate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kate Allen. I am the manager of the technical advisor team at Oregon Housing and Community Services in the affordable rental housing section.
Oh, excellent. Glad you're here. Jason.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Mackey. I am a technical advisor with Oregon Housing and Community Services. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jason. Gail.
Hi, Gail Hendrickson, Clatsop County Community Development.
Brett.
Hi there, Brett Estes. I'm the North Coast Regional Representative for the Department of Land, Conservation and Development.
All right, and Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm the Oregon for Everyone manager at 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and I'm coming from Corvallis.
Welcome. And I'm assuming Read AI meeting is not a person. Is that safe bet? I think so. All right. We'll go ahead and get started here. We have someone else who joined us.
Okay.
And this person I know, and she does have to sing her introduction. So sing your introduction for us. Who are you and where are you from?
I'm Sarah Lou. I'm not going to sing, but Director of the Columbia Pacific Economic Development District.
All right, thanks. Glad you're here. Very, very glad you're here. Again, welcome. I'm hopeful we're all going to learn something a bit today. I'm going to turn it over immediately to Alyssa, who's going to introduce our guest speaker.
Hi, everyone. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to note that this will be Jay's last meeting. And so let's enjoy his humor and smooth running of this meeting before we all have to take over his responsibility. So thank you for everything you've done at this meeting.
Yeah.
And now I'm actually so excited to be able to introduce our speaker, Gil Kelly, who you met briefly before. He has an extensive biography as a planner. I would say he's one of Oregon's best planners, one of the nation's best urban planners. He's worked all up and down the West Coast. There's like a whole biography I could read. I had the pleasure of getting to work with him. It's 20 years-ish ago, let's just say, when he was the planning director for the city of Portland, and I was just a little baby planner working on some of his big initiatives like the River Renaissance and a bunch of other cool things in Portland, and had the chance to learn and work from him. And so it's a pleasure to be able to bring him here. The reason we even started this conversation is one of the places he's worked, and he'll tell you more about, is the city of Vancouver, which worked on an empty homes tax. And I think there are some lessons learned that continue the conversation that this group has been having over time. But also he's worked on housing and planning in so many different in-demand cities in the West Coast, from Vancouver, BC to San Francisco to Portland, that there's just a lot of lessons he's learned over his career that I think could really help us just sort of get a more contextualized view of what we have on the table and what might work for us and what are the challenges and opportunities we have to work through. And so I'm really pleased that Gil is here to talk to us. I also quickly want to say, and Gil, I don't know if you're going to introduce Jackie or if I should.
You can go ahead. That's fine, Alyssa. Either way.
Oh, yeah, I thought it would be a part of the conversation. So
Yeah.
part of what I'm hoping to do is, right, build the capacity for all of us to build more housing here throughout the county, and having the expertise of Gil is one way to do that. But he is also a member of the board of Thousand Friends of Oregon. And so Jackie Lee is one of the staff members of Thousand Friends of Oregon and working on basically housing issues throughout the whole state. And so we can give her a chance to talk more at some point in the meeting too about what she's working on. And hopefully there will be resources and assistance available to our group as well, to our cities and counties. And so I'm just happy that we get Gil and we get Thousand Friends of Oregon as part of this conversation. And so with that, Mr. Kelly, I would like to turn it over to you and we can take it from there.
Okay, well, thank you, Alyssa, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you all for in advance for being patient and listening through my presentation. I kind of pared it down to keep it so there's a time for discussion amongst us, and I've done my best to kind of understand the issues on the North Coast in general and in Clatsop County in particular. And Alyssa's been very helpful, and I've read through the recently published housing inventory, which was really, really good background information for me. So, but even so, pardon my gaps of knowledge about the local detail. So I'm mostly going to be talking about, as Alyssa said, some precedents I think that could apply in Clatsop County that I'm familiar with from working in other places. Some of those are the major cities that Alyssa mentioned, and some are working with DLCD on a number of rulemaking committees over the years, as well as directly interfacing with a number of cities and towns throughout the state. And part of that is through my role at 1000 Friends, which I've just been nominated and elected to be the president of the board of as of a week ago. So, and just real briefly on that piece, just wanted to let you know, and Jackie is new to the organization. I'm delighted that she's here because her program called Oregon for Everyone is really meant to broaden the base of affordable housing throughout the state in big cities and small towns. And so she is really getting to know different groups, whether those are advocacy groups for housing, whether those are local elected officials, or bodies like yours, or development interests to kind of see what we can help bring in terms of organizing capacity, in terms of technical assistance, in terms of just a range of things that Jackie has experience in. So I'm delighted that she's here. I wanted to say that Thousand Friends has just been through a multi-month process now of devising our next 5-year strategic plan. And very quickly about that, just wanted to let you know that although we're known primarily as an organization, and Brett and others will know this as defenders of the Oregon land use planning system and particular strength around preserving working lands, farm and forest lands. But we have also along the way been really active in community building and making complete equitable and walkable, pleasant communities around the state. And that's become a major focus of ours now, beginning with this new strategic plan, really ramping up our activities in cities and towns across the state and with counties as well to really try to make whatever land within the urban growth boundaries that exist at any point in time the most vibrant and sustainable and multi-use, multi-generational as possible. So I wanted to just say that. We also have a couple of other streams of activity which we're ramping up. One is called the first that I mentioned is called For Our Land. The second is For Our Communities. The third is For Our Economy, because we're finding a lot of interest and a lot of implications for land use in terms of how the economy is shaped and shepherded. So we're getting more and more into those kinds of issues around the state, whether those are around the CHIPS Act or around traditional industries or new and emerging industries like CLT, mass timber, and others. So that's an exciting piece for us to have a seat at the table within those discussions. And finally, we have an initiative called For Our Democracy, which is really opening up the decision-making processes to be transparent and accessible to the general public so they know what's happening, but also alongside that with education, training, and dialogue with groups like yours. So just really happy to have that kind of full-fledged strategic plan written down, and we'll be publishing that very shortly, and it'll be on our website at 1,000 Friends. So I have the pleasure of doing that, but I'm speaking to you mostly today as a kind of a veteran planner and economic development guy, as Alyssa mentioned, having worked as planning director in Portland, in Berkeley in my early days, in San Francisco, and in Vancouver, British Columbia. And then as a consultant along the way with other cities, including cities in China, Brazil, and the Netherlands. So I've seen a lot, and I've, stewarded some organizations through some big changes, and I'm just really delighted to be able to share that now in my quasi-retirement. I still do some advising of cities and private parties as well, but mostly now I'm doing this kind of thing. So I'm delighted to be here and want to learn more from you about Clatsop County. Again, I just really appreciate my conversations with Alyssa and her providing me some documents to deepen my understanding. So Alyssa is actually going to move the slides for me because I often get tripped up in trying to do a screen share here. So we could start with the title slide, I guess.
Just so you know, it's actually Robert who's doing the slides. I'm just
Oh,
gonna.
well, thank you, Robert. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of say this is really about approaches to developing and conserving affordable housing. And my focus here is on things I think might be applicable from my own experience without deep knowledge of Clatsop County, but things I think might be applicable just from my scan and from my conversations with Alyssa and with a week or so, about a week ago, with the Housing Club of Astoria, a kind of informal conversation there. Next slide. You can skip the next one and go to the third one, I think. Yeah, so I just I've kind of mentioned this, but it's really I'm coming from these different perspectives here and just laying out what I think from my experience might be applicable. And it's really then up to you and a discussion following my presentation to see which of these might bear further investigation and fruit. Happy to continue to help with you as will Jackie. So I kind of previewed some topics with Alyssa, and she said they're all good, but I think in the interest of time, the ones that are highlighted in blue are part of the presentation. I'm happy to talk about any of the others in the discussion period. So I wanted to begin with some overarching principles before we take a deep dive into any of these components of the toolkit, the housing toolkit. But I'm not going to read these. You can see them on the screen. Hopefully, can you read the slides from where you are?
Yep.
Okay. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to say my view of why I think these topics are important and relevant in Clatsop County. One is your housing prices are very high, and in several cities, they're rising very fast. A couple places they've declined slightly, but for the most part, housing prices are rising steeply and quickly, and they're already high. And the flip side of that, of course, is the affordability of those prices to local residents. And both for renters and for owners, the percentage of households in Clatsop County, both the unincorporated areas and in the cities, of rent-burdened households and owner burdened households for mortgages is a very high percentage. So I don't know that you stand out amongst all Oregon counties, but you're up there in the top percentages of people who are or either not housed and having to travel long distances, or in some cases may actually be homeless. But for those who are housed, they're spending much more than their 30% of their income on housing. And that's what we mean by rent burdened. There's also, in my view, scanning the data again that Alyssa provided to me, a lack of housing options for workforce and low-income households. And we'll get to some detail on that in just a moment. And there's a very high percentage of what we call empty homes. At least that's how we referred to them in Vancouver. And I'll talk a bit about the Vancouver situation on empty homes in a moment. But this includes things that are seasonally occupied by owners who come in the summer for several weeks or a month or two. Um, and those are distinguished from short-term rentals, which are kind of a different kettle of fish, but also have an impact on the housing supply of existing homes. That is to say, they're homes that are sitting there that are not being used for most of the year, or if they are, they're short-term rental. And that's essentially occupying a huge supply of the county's housing, and not enough new housing is being produced to offset that piece. So we'll get into more of that. And I think also it's fair to say the county's population is aging. It's already, I think, slightly above the average age for counties in Oregon. And that's just part of, the attraction of the coast, of people retiring, and of long-term residents just aging in place. So that's a factor. And, I just wanted to touch on the homelessness piece because people often don't like to talk about it very much and often think of it as a Portland metro issue. And it's not. It's here in Clackamas County as well. And so I just wanted to spend a little time on that piece. Next slide, please. So just to fill this out, and again, this is coming from the report that was just published on your housing inventory. Um, Here are the median home prices in the cities, Astoria, Gerhardt, Seaside, Warrenton, and Cannon Beach. And I mean, the Cannon Beach one is kind of off the charts, but the other cities are high as well. Astoria and Warrenton are sort of the most affordable, but even for many of people needing housing, particularly people who are working as teachers, firefighters, baristas, restaurant workers, hotel workers, and so forth. These are hard for them to get into the housing ownership market if they're not already there. And you can see on the right-hand column the percentage of increase just in 1 year. So look at Gearhart's up 10% in 1 year, and Cannon Beach, unbelievably 25% in a year over year. That's just an astounding number by any measure. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned the rent burden households. This is the breakdown by cities and including the unincorporated county area. You can see from this graph the percentage of households in many of these cities are above 50% that are rent burdened. And so they're either working 2 or 3 jobs or they're commuting long distance to get to their work if their work is in Clatsop County, or they're just not doing other important things in their lives to be able to hang on to their rent. So when you're getting up above 50%, and some are at one is at Gerhardt, I think, is at 65%. This means that those aren't complete communities anymore. They're only there for the most well-to-do, and everyone who works in the shops and services and so forth is expected to live somewhere else, I guess. And those somewhere else places are fast disappearing in the county just from looking at this chart alone. Next. And Alyssa, if I need to correct any of this, please jump in. But I think your documents were quite clear. The other thing I want to just do is to scan the housing production, and I think these are, Alyssa, new starts, not completions, but I could be wrong about that.
They're completions.
Okay, so in either case, so completion's even more telling. It's hard for you to read this probably online, but the dark green is single family. And so you can see in the unincorporated part of the county, particularly a few years ago, there was virtually mostly single family being constructed. And in the later years, more 1 and 2 family units. That's the blue bar, the light blue portion of the bar, with manufactured being in the kind of yellow there. As you move across to the right on this graph, you get each city, so Cannon Beach, Gerhardt, Seaside, Warrenton, and Astoria. And I guess what I wanted to point out here is not only the dominance of single-family construction in many of those communities, but the tiny bit in the darkest blue of multifamily. And if you're going to address workforce housing needs, whether that's ownership, affordable ownership, or whether that's rental, you're not going to build your way out of this problem you have with those kind of paltry numbers of multifamily. So just putting that out there. Next. And then this is just a dramatic graphic here, again provided by Alyssa, of the percentage of empty homes in the dark blue and short-term rentals in the red. I mean, if you look at Cannon Beach, you got, more than three-quarters of the housing stock there not being fully used or available to local residents. And you look at Seaside, Gearhart, same kind of situation. The county is roughly a quarter, and Astoria not too far behind that. Warrenton has the most available housing to local residents. So I wanted to highlight this one because it is relevant to what I'll talk about in a little bit later in the presentation around some kind of pioneering work we did in the city of Vancouver, Canada, where I was planning director for 5 years on dealing with the empty homes phenomenon, which was really beginning to proliferate during my tenure there. Next. So before diving into the toolkit here, and again, I'm being selective about which tools in the toolkit are part of the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about any of those or beyond those. Just, I was sitting back and thinking about what are sort of the guiding principles to have an effective strategy for the county and the cities in the county over, say, the next decade, and taking that longer term look before you dive into the immediate opportunities or difficulties or problems or politics of any one strategy, to just think about what makes a good holistic strategy. And I think it has to start with assessing your needs by city and by county holistically before starting to jump in on individual solutions. And I think your report does a good job in many aspects of that. Part of that is looking at not the population as a whole or at large or in an abstract sense, but really breaking it down into housing types and matching those with incomes. And that was very helpful for us in Vancouver, and I'll show you a little bit about that work. Third is to both consider supply and demand approaches. And so our Vancouver empty homes tax was a way of diverting some of the demand that was just overpowering the market for luxury homes and not steering all the development interest away from doing more affordable housing and rental housing. So supply and demand, if we focus only on supply, you're probably not going to get there or get there soon enough. And the corollary there, number four, is to consider in your strategies both building new, which is a good and powerful activity to engage in at the city level, but also conserving existing housing in equal measure, because the bulk of affordable housing is already on the ground and people are living in it. Now that's disappearing quickly given the short-term rental and empty homes phenomenon accelerating in the county. But it's really important to conserve existing housing as you build new, because you're probably not going to build your way out of this alone. And that's true for big cities and small across the country. Next. And there are four more principles I would throw out here. One is on the regulation side. It's a very easy principle to articulate, sometimes harder to do, but cities are in charge of their own zoning ordinances and so forth. And the basic tenet that I've held for years is to make the right thing easy to do and the not so great things harder to do. And that just should be the guiding principle as you look at your zoning codes, with the idea of facilitating the creation of new affordable housing, and to some extent even market rate housing. So that goes to things like zoning regulations, but also goes to fees and so forth and so on. Next is to make partnerships across the sector. So, working with the development community is really important, working with nonprofits, working with organizations like Thousand Friends and Jackie, um, going across political boundaries to form partnerships around good projects or good policies. Those things make an enormous difference, and bring everybody to the table to help solve a problem. Um, the idea that sort of a corollary to that is leveraging the other investments that the cities may be making, whether that's in infrastructure or in community facilities or Main Street improvements or renovations, making the housing, the sort of infill housing projects work alongside those, both helps garner support for those infrastructure pledges, but also it helps with the cost and the willingness of developers to take risk, for example, on investing in housing. So think about, as cities, you have this great ability to look at both sides of that, both the investment kinds of actions. And finally, engaging in dialogue and education and good messaging. This came up quite a bit in our recent conversation in Astoria around not simply just organizing is a part of it, but how to really say very clearly what it is you want to do and why, and making that message penetrate to people's individual and collective interests, their sense of community and what they want, and why this policy you may be introducing or this project you may be considering are important to that. And really making that in terms of very human and daily life terms for people, or in terms of the town that their children or grandchildren are going to inherit. So that's just a high level overview. I just thought I'd throw out those principles, and I think you're well on your way to doing many of these in your housing strategy. But I would just want to say I think it's important to keep all of these in mind as a framework for developing whatever your ultimate strategy becomes. Next. Am I going too fast for anybody? We okay?
We're good.
Okay. Just wanted to talk about some precedents from my own experience that I think are helpful. One of those was when I was asked to come to Vancouver. I was in San Francisco working there in the planning department. And then I got a call from the mayor in Vancouver who said, I hear you're working on housing stuff in San Francisco, and boy, we need help. We've been focused on being the most sustainable city on earth, but we have a housing crisis. So would you come up here and do your magic here? And so I eventually did. And the first task the mayor handed me was to do a 10-year affordable housing strategy, which we ended up calling Housing Vancouver. And we developed that in a few short months, less than a year, and until from the start, from our research and engagement, broad engagement across the city with a lot of groups that hadn't typically been involved, including renters, immigrant groups, developers, all kinds of folks, and getting the strategy written and reviewed and tested, and then to council for adoption. So it was a intense and thorough, but fairly quick process to do that. And we set key objectives, and I'll go through these in just a moment real quickly with a slide for each. We set housing targets. This is very important, I think, part of the work ahead of you, and it's kind of just jumping out at you when you look at your housing inventory report. And those targets should be set not just in pure numbers, but by housing type or building type and by tenure. So by tenure, I mean owner versus renter, or even there are other forms of tenure, co-ops and land trusts and so forth and so on. And then those targets should additionally be set by matching housing type and income, because that's where you know you're really getting specific and targeting the audience you want to target. And there are multiple audiences, of course. So you need to have a target for each of those income groups by housing type. And then finally, we kind of look broadly at how do we open up the planning and funding toolbox in Vancouver. And I just wanted to say before going any further, many people who may have visited but haven't spent a lot of time in Vancouver think of it as a large city and a very metropolitan and international city. The last 2 points are true. The first point is in raw numbers of population, the city and the metro region of Vancouver are nearly identical to Portland. So it's not a New York or a Shanghai or an LA. It's a modest sized West Coast, big for the West Coast city, same size as Portland, smaller than Seattle. Portland's GDP, annual GDP, is actually 1.5 to 2 times of Vancouver. Vancouver has a very tight economy, really composed of three things, being export of natural resources, number one, through their port, um, tourism, number two, and that has some relationship to Clatsop County. And third is actually building high-rise condominiums, largely for foreign investors, is the third economic driver there. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of that context. And the other piece of that is that 90% of the landscape inside the city of Vancouver are very low density neighborhoods. So people have that image of the downtown peninsula and the high rises, but a lot of what I'm talking about today that we did in Vancouver is very applicable to smaller cities or to cities with largely single family landscapes. So next. This is just the cover sheet from our Housing Vancouver strategy. It's been updated once since I left, but we started this was adopted in 2017, and it's been quite successful in terms of implementing, partly because we were very targeted and strategic, and we were also at the same time broad in our look at the possible tools for implementation. Next. So at a very high level, these were the kind of the underpinnings of the strategy. Create the right supply. So often planners and city councils um, are sort of accused, if you will, by development interests of, well, you just don't want supply. You're making all these rules and policies and da 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 da, and just, give us land or give us free this or free that or quick permits or whatever, and we'll deliver supply. The problem in many locations, this is true across Oregon as well as in British Columbia, is that pure supply tends to be uh, attractive to the development community when it has the highest return. And that's the most expensive kind of housing because that's where the big profits are. And that soaks up a lot of the development energy. So we said, look, we're not going to argue that we don't need supply. We need supply, but we need the right supply. And the right supply meant affordable housing and housing types that are not getting produced. And so back to that graph you saw of the cities in Clatsop County where very, very little multifamily housing is being produced at all. And really the workforce is being shut out as housing prices increase and rents rise. So the right supply became our focus, and that was kind of an antidote to the calls for developers to say, just give us what we want and we'll develop supply. The second thing was because of Vancouver's particular connection to Hong Kong in particular, there was huge speculation beginning in about 2015, right before my arrival there, and just ramped up continuously, where foreign investors were forming syndicates and exporting money from mostly Hong Kong, but also Singapore and Kuala Lumpur to escape, particularly the mainland China, the government of central China, to tighten up flow of capital outside China. And so what people were doing in anticipation of that was essentially forming these syndicates and buying property and building tall towers in Vancouver. And often what would happen with those, so it was a place to park their money safely and where maybe their children would go to college or maybe somebody in the family would eventually move there. But many of those properties, and they were soaking up all the development interest and capital in the region. And so then local BC owners were taking equity out of their homes to pile on, and it became this wild speculative economy just out of the reach of most folks there. And in fact, because a lot of it was just a safe place to park money, there were whole towers downtown just sitting dark, sitting empty. And so that kind of motivated us to think about the empty homes tax, which I'll get to a bit later. Protecting and retaining the rental stock. So again, here, the retaining existing homes that were, built in and apartments built in the 70s when Canada in general and Vancouver in particular was building a lot of rental housing from the 40s to the 70s, and then suddenly, because of tax changes and other things in Canadian national politics, that money flow was shut off for rental housing, and so nothing had been built since the 70s in rental at all until I arrived, and we changed the uh, incentives to do more rental. And so there was a huge missing hole in the rental supply for people who couldn't afford home ownership and yet wanted to live and work in Vancouver. And then finally, to support vulnerable residents, because as prices rose and landlords could get more for rents, they would find ways around rent control rules and so forth. And there was a lot of displacement going on. And this was extremely the case in San Francisco, where I worked before, where whole neighborhoods were essentially just changed over because of the latest tech boom, which is really around social media and so forth. Whole neighborhoods were really displaced of long-term working residents and the occupied by what's become known as the tech bros. So any case, we want to posit these four kind of drivers of the Housing Vancouver strategy next. So here's what I was referring to in terms of setting targets, and I think this is important for you all to do as well, over a 10-year horizon. So we set a 10-year target based on what we saw as population growth and as the housing need. Now, some of that in the first column of numbers there are stuff already in the pipeline, and which can take anywhere from 2 to 3 or more years. And so that condo line in the pink there, salmon colored in the middle, is not expressed as a true need. It's really a fact that there was a huge amount of supply based on the conditions I just told you about already in. And we couldn't or didn't necessarily want to shut that off. What we wanted to do was augment that with these other types. So social and supportive housing, which is the most attractive and accommodating for low income. Purpose-built rental, which can work for middle income folks as well. Laneways are what we call ADUs here. Laneways there because they're back alleys, they're lanes throughout the city, and so they would allow, before I came even, cottages to be constructed, and we simplified those rules and made sure that that class of structure were rental only. You couldn't subdivide the parcel or condo the parcel because these were small lots, single family areas for the most part. And then coach houses, which are the same thing except they're for ownership. And then townhouses, which could be either, and they were houses were actually, had common walls and so forth. And so you can see we just annualized the target in just straight across. So we just had 10% of that as an annual target. And the annual target really helped both the permitting offices, the city council, and everyone else involved in the development and permitting process to say, are we meeting? And we would report annually, are we meeting these numbers or not? Knowing in the first couple of years we wouldn't, but over time, averaging out, we would. Next. And then the next thing is to do that same kind of segregation by type, but also by income. And so you can see the top line is really that social and supportive housing, and you can see the income categories there. So there's a bunch being produced below $80,000 per year per household income. A smaller segment in the 80 to 150,000 income a year per household. And then as you move down in the range there of colors, you get into the higher income, but still much needed housing. So this was a way that we knew we were targeting the need based on our research of who is already living there and what the income profiles look like, and who is coming to Vancouver over the next decade as a projection, and really being very specific about, okay, what kind of housing do we need to suit these income tiers? And then the next piece of that, which I won't go into mapping wise, is just, okay, where in the city do we do this? And that was a combination of infill in formerly single-family neighborhoods. It was infill of slightly larger scale on commercial shopping streets, and then taller and more dense around light rail station areas and in the downtown and central city areas. So, and then we would report back to the council each year on, well, how are we doing on this stuff? And if we're not doing well, what are the circumstances that need to be looked at further? Next. And then I finally said on that list of what all this was about, looking at both the supply side and demand side tools. So on the supply side, here are the things that we looked at, revisiting inclusionary zoning requirements. So there are already requirements at a certain scale of project that you have a certain amount that are set aside as affordable, either for low income or middle income, and the middle income was a higher percentage of the total number of units than the low. Using density bonuses more strategically and aggressively, and to focus a lot of those bonuses on building rental, which is a big missing piece of the housing supply. And then working with nonprofit housing providers to actually help develop and operate many of these projects. And some were entirely private developer owned and maintained, and that was fine. And they would often be required to or voluntarily include long-term affordable housing as part of those, as a sort of community benefit that was expected from the city that could be malleable as to what it was, but much of it was for affordable housing within private developments. And then to create an affordable housing fund that could be used to leverage other people's money to build housing more aggressively, using city-owned land, particularly not selling the land, but on long-term leases for affordable housing, temporary modular housing, particularly for the homeless, and then there's some things that are maybe a little bit peculiar to Canada and to Vancouver in particular, which are a very aggressive land value capture, because for any substantial project you had to go through a discretionary city council approval process with hearing and all that to increase the density on any site. So that was suddenly the land was worth a lot more than what they had paid for it, and so we took some of that back to plow back into affordable housing and other community benefits. In Canada, you can zone by tenure. Here in the US, you can't, but you can apply density bonuses and other approval incentives to rental housing as opposed to ownership housing.
Okay, you gonna be out there? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay. On the demand side, and I mentioned this before, the empty homes tax was a key piece of that because what it's essentially doing is not trying to chase demand with supply, but actually tamping down a certain portion of the demand. And that demand was for these luxury homes that were left vacant. They were just places for people to park money and really skewing the whole development train and the whole permitting process in that direction. The province actually declared a luxury homes tax, and so we were partial beneficiaries of that. And then we set developer contributions across the city by district with differing values, which was as you do a development, it's scaled to the size of that development. You owe so much to the city in terms of developer contributions, which were used for a variety of things, including the Affordable Housing Fund. And then partnership agreements with senior governments in particular, which was really important for bringing other money and other authorities to bear. And then final slide in this section. Next. Looking at different construction methods. Modular housing we used in a big way for homeless transition in particular, but it can be used in other ways as well. Prefab building components and mass timber or CLT construction. These are really emerging components. Sorry.
Sorry, it's just the bingo club next door being let out.
Oh, okay.
Get a little less background.
Wondering if it was a question or an objection.
Just the bingo.
Okay. Okay, so that's kind of like the background of our approach in Vancouver. And then I wanted to dive into a few specifics that I think might be applicable here. I hope that overview was helpful just for context. So part of it was, as I mentioned, Vancouver really is mostly made up of low density neighborhoods. And so we looked at kind of three types of neighborhoods, if you will, or neighborhood development patterns. One was what we called the transition area. Those were often between purely deeply single family and graduating up to more closer to the commercial streets or where there was bus service or whatever. And so that's the upper left group of buildings. So a lot of these were made to sort of mimic the neighborhood character. There were a few more modern contemporary designs like the one in the far upper left, but the one just below it you can see is actually a fourplex that's meant to mimic traditional housing forms in Vancouver neighborhoods. And these were, there was some suspicion at first, but these were very well accepted for the most part. And in many cases, these were owners of lots who would then replace their homes with these larger but still nicely designed homes. And so they had their mortgage paid off and they could sell these other units or rent them out for income. And then the upper right, you can sort of see the transition area that were more apartment building types. And so, again, a mix of conserving and rehabilitating existing older apartments and building new that would again fit in the neighborhood. So these tended to be anywhere from 3 to 5 stories. So again, they can fit in a lot of different neighborhood contexts. And then what we called ground-oriented infill, which are the more the duplex, triplex kind of thing, and the laneway cottages like the one in the lower left of that lower piece there. So a lot of tweaks in the zoning code to enable these, and I won't go into all the detail on that, but if you're interested, I certainly can provide that information. Next. We also wanted to make sure that we were tapping the design talent in the community and really engaging neighborhoods and city leaders across the region. So as the planning director in the city of Vancouver, I sponsored this design competition for select neighborhoods throughout the metro region. So even some in Vancouver, but most of the sites were actually in surrounding suburban jurisdictions. And again, mostly in low to very moderate density neighborhoods, primarily single family neighborhoods where there was an interest in doing some infill. And so we had a competition where teams would form themselves according to certain instructions by us, which included do good designs that you think will provide some level of affordable housing and a mix of housing types, a mix of different generations and abilities, and in some cases, even a mix of uses like live work or some modest amount of commercial space and maybe some common open spaces. And look not just at a single site, but look at a whole block or even multi-blocks. And make sure on your team you have an architect, a landscape architect, a planner who knows the local codes where they're working, and fourthly, someone with actual development experience that can, because part of your requirement is to develop a pro forma to see will this thing actually work? And they almost all did. A few pointed to where some gaps were needed to fill through some other source of funds. And the planner on the teams was basically there to say, with this design, here are the few things in the local zoning code that really need to be relaxed or changed. And the outgrowth of this is they were highly embraced by neighborhoods and by local city councils. And almost every city council ended up changing their zoning codes to accommodate this kind of development. And it's now starting to be built, which is pretty thrilling. Something that I've talked with Thousand Friends about sponsoring with other groups around the state to do across the state, including potentially in Clatsop County, if you guys would be interested in doing such a thing. So, so Jackie and I are putting our heads together to kind of organize that in the early days here. Next. I talked about the need to recapture the rental supply, and part of that was through tenant protections in existing buildings and that kind of thing, and we did various things along those lines. But part of it was to build new rental housing. And so, for example, this first item is on our commercial streets or shopping streets, as they're called in Canada. We allowed 4 stories as of right. In some districts, they had to have ground floor commercial or a certain amount, but basically they were a mixed use, but primarily housing project. And those were allowed at 4 stories. And that's great to build a real lively shopping district. Um, and we said, well, but almost all of those are being built as condos or what they call in Canada strata. And we said, we really need to get them to do rental, and rental won't give you the quick return, quick flip, and the maximum short-term profit as a developer. So what if we actually allowed them to build 2 more floors? So we kind of surveyed the landscape and said, in most places, 6 versus 4, particularly with the top floor step back, isn't going to be all that recognized, all that, overpowering to local residents. So we did that. That's been successful. We did something called a moderate income rental project, where on certain key corners in the city, we allowed even taller buildings up to 8, or even in a couple cases up to 12. But in return, they had to provide a certain percentage of permanently affordable lower moderate income units as part of that project. And we had a rental project saying, let's try 10 of these across the city. And boy, the developers snapped that up. They really did. So if you're thinking about a downtown site in Astoria, for example, I mean, that kind of project, the policy could work. We also wanted to make sure that at a certain scale, and I can't remember if we settled on 20 units or 15 units or more in a project, that 25% of the units had to be non-market, so affordable. And those could be affordable to moderate income. They didn't have to be low income. I described the land lift model a few minutes ago, where we took a certain amount out of the rezoning increase in value. Low density infill incentives, which were a lot of things there to get infill both in the low density areas and in these moderate areas, was to revise our parking requirements, lessen the parking requirements, to in some cases waive or moderate certain what we would call SDCs here, system development charges, and so on and so forth. And then where we had transit lines, which is not applicable to you all other than bus transit, but maybe in the future there'll be bringing back the coast rail system. We allowed going up to 30 stories in places where we really wanted, near transit stations and so forth, wanted to pump up the amount of rental supply. And so that's what that last bullet was about. Next. And the other thing is, we didn't want to just spend the time at the moderate and high income levels, but go all the way down into serving the homeless. And Vancouver, like many West Coast cities, had this huge influx of homelessness during the opioid crisis, and continues with fentanyl. And so there were just an explosion of the number of homeless on the streets in Vancouver. And that's not an image that people associate frequently with Vancouver. But if you look at the downtown East Side district, for example, it's akin to some of the worst you've seen in American cities, including the Civic Plaza in San Francisco and the Tenderloin and so forth. And so what we did is, okay, the humane thing to do is to look for places to house people outside of just a temporary shelter, which is fine for, a few days or during the winter or whatever. And so we appealed to the province and got funding for 1,200 units of what we called temporary modular housing, TMH, across Vancouver. And we deployed that pretty quickly. So the council there gave me the authority and the burden as planning director of approving these without an appealable action to city council. And so this was our first little trial demonstration project on a piece of city land. And you can see the inside of the units, and the fact that in that kind of on the right side, the upper image there, of how these are stacked. So they're prefabricated to our specifications, and they're stackable in all kinds of different configurations with setbacks or, variations in the bulk and so forth and so on. So based on this one, we said, let's go for it. So we took the province up on its offer, and took the money and purchased and then redesigned these. This is the very first one. They actually became much better in their design. They all had landscaping, often vegetable gardens and so forth. And the homeless folks who were the best suited to make a transition eventually into permanent housing were the best candidates for occupying these. So we ended up placing these in 12 different neighborhoods across the city, many moderate and high income neighborhoods. And aside from the first round of, you know, screaming and anxiety, and, you know, I can't tell you how many arrows in my chest from community meetings. The first one I approved ended up with 0 complaints. And that's been the case with all the rest of them. They've just become part of the fabric of the neighborhood and at a very cheap cost. So it was about 100,000 per unit in terms of the unit and placement and hookup costs. The land was all free because we were using either city-owned sites or, in many cases, privately owned sites owned by developers who were in a waiting period either to get their planning approvals or hadn't quite yet figured out what their project was going to be, and they just leased their sites to us for $1 a year for a minimum of 5 years and up to 10. So I just wanted to show you that we kind of looked at all aspects of the need and tried to find workable solutions and funding for each one. Next. The other piece around the homeless that I found really interesting working in San Francisco was thinking about the continuum of need for transition out of homelessness, because so many cities, including Portland recently with the new mayor, are very focused on emergency shelters. And that's important, getting people off the street, particularly in inclement weather and as a kind of a temporary situation. A couple of things in San Francisco that really struck me as being more profound are looking at the whole continuum of some, like put yourself in that person's shoes and you're able to be a functioning member of society, but you don't have the means to get there, and you end up in a bad cycle of getting back up on the street. Well, the next step there was a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, pioneered this notion of a navigation center where actually couples could go together, even with their pet, and be there for 3 months or even longer if what was needed, and get their feet, their sort of get grounded, get counseling, and open up pathways for different solutions for them. And one of those pathways was to the next bullet, which is taking a fairly substantial stock of single room occupancy, SRO, housing that was older buildings, but not fully used in San Francisco, and sprucing those up and making whatever code improvements needed to be made, but again, relatively cheap to do that. So they had their own permanent unit. It was a small efficiency unit, sort of akin to what you were seeing in the modular housing on the last slide. But these are in, you know, permanent brick and mortars buildings, generally in the central part of San Francisco. And that allowed them the sense of being, well, okay, now I can take a shower and get dressed each morning. I can go look for a job, or I can take a job I really don't want, but at least it gives me income. And they had a minimal rent. And that was such a missing gap in most cities' approaches that I've seen to getting people actually out of homelessness, those who are able to make that transition. And then ultimately, then as their incomes increase, to find affordable housing, permanent affordable housing for themselves of some kind. So just wanted to sort of play that out for you as a wraparound for the homeless piece. Next. Some other precedents here. Some of these are from Vancouver work, some in San Francisco, Portland, Berkeley, other places I've worked or consulted for. Incenting rental housing, which I think is a need on the coast, because not everybody's going to be able to afford to own. Um, um, as I mentioned, the extra floors on the commercial corridors or shopping streets, where you can incent rental versus condominiums, and potentially with the density bonus there, get some amount of permanently affordable housing as a percent, even if it's just a modest percent of the units, particularly in more sizable projects. Imposing inclusionary housing requirements for those large projects. So even if they don't take advantage of the bonus, which they most likely would, but if they don't, there's still a baseline inclusionary requirement. Now you saw in Vancouver, because the real estate market was so hot and it has such high values, we could command up to 25% of not just the units, but the floor area in buildings, however you divided that into units.
Hey, Gail, can I interrupt and apologize? I wanted to ask a question. We're talking about incentivizing different housing constructions. And earlier you talked about how we change the demand,
Yeah.
how we change the demand that we are seeing in our area. In a highly recreational county, there isn't a huge demand in the natural market for 4-story, 8-story, or 12-story structures.
Right.
And there is huge demand for a quiet little piece of land where I can walk to the beach.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering how, again, we don't have a jobs base that is drawing in huge numbers of people, but how do we change that demand that we experience all the time?
Yeah, well, we'll shine a light on that during the empty homes tax piece, but I think these are scalable concepts. You do have downtowns in all the cities. You do have commercial streets. Sometimes it's the old highway running through town. Sometimes it's other sites that are available. So I think whatever your zoning, in this one particular piece around density bonuses or other ways of increasing floor area for some amount of affordability, you look at your existing zoning code and say, well, what are the heights allowed now? And would we be willing to push those a bit to get development to be more attractive to a private investor and to be able to get some affordability out of it? And sometimes just getting pure rental, regardless of the strict affordability, is worthwhile. So I think these are scalable concepts, but I get your bigger picture idea, and I'd love to get more into that in the discussion period after we get through some of the empty homes tax work, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, let's get to the empty homes tax.
Okay. And so just, one thing on rental, and again, this works for more substantial, bigger projects, so it may not apply, with the exception of a few sites in Clatsop County. We really reached out to and worked with the pension funds as the key investors for rental because they don't have the same time or profit pressure that a local developer does. So they would often work with a local developer as kind of the front and maybe a small piece of the equity equation. But these are, retired teachers funds. These are firefighter unions. They have huge amounts of money. And they're just looking for a safe long-term return. Their return can be 3 to 6%, not 8 to 12%. And so it's a very, very different, developing rental is just a very, very different approach than developing ownership. And I just wanted to kind of point out one of the underpinnings there. And again, doing some breaks, as I described before, on development standards and fees. In some cases in Portland, we used to do tax holidays or deferments for certain kinds of housing near transit and some amount of affordability and so forth and so on. And then just really making sure that our review processes were fast and efficient, particularly for someone coming in to do a conforming development. It conforms to zoning. Let's not torture them for months. And so just the speed really improved the attractiveness for private parties to come in and develop. Next. So I've kind of gone through most of this. I just wanted to say this was a real experiment and turned out to be highly successful to humanely house homeless folks and get them into a transitionary path. These were located across the city. They were fast, efficient to do, well designed. As I mentioned, no complaints. And the number is really quite affordable when you think about the time it takes and the money it takes to build traditional housing. Next. And so here I want to get to the empty homes tax. And we had a robust discussion about this a week or so ago at the Astoria Housing Club. Again, the context there was such a big influx of luxury housing, and most of the development energy was going that way, particularly for offshore buyers. And it really skewed the marketplace. So there were at least 2,000 and probably actually more but we could put our hands on about 2,000 right away that were empty. Again, I just picture downtown Vancouver, those high towers, and a whole bunch of them just being completely dark and unoccupied, residential towers. So we knew if that's where the demand was coming from, just to park money safely, and then on the part of more local investors to piggyback on the speculative values of those, then that's just a whole bunch of new housing supply that's not serving Vancouverites at all. So we seized upon the notion of imposing a tax on those empty units, whether the whole building was empty or not, didn't matter. It could be a portion of them. And so basically we created a system whereby, well, let's go to the next slides because we get into it in a bit more detail here. We really wanted to get these units reoccupied, whether that was by the owners or by renters. We didn't care. And we just sort of arrived at this notion that if you're not occupying it for at least 6 months out of the year, then you're subject to the tax. And the tax was equivalent initially to 1%, and we raised it to 1.5% of the assessed valuation annually. And it was an honor system. People had to come forward and say, I'm not doing that. And we had a way of auditing that because we were able to see utility bills and records. And so we could audit. But we had a very robust turnout, even in the first year when it was a brand new program. I think we raised about $30 million in 1 year from the very first year in this. But we just wanted to stem the tide of more and more units being built and left empty. So this was kind of the anti-speculation piece of it. And you can see the link there to go to if you'd like to learn more detail. But I've got a little bit of detail coming up. Let's go to the next slide. So it's I won't get into the class of residential, but it's basically single family homes all the way up to rental condo, or excuse me, up to high-rise condo towers. And the 3% was an initial guess. We lowered that back down to 1.3, so I should probably correct that slide for confusion's sake. Next. So self declarations were required by the owners for a certain date each year. And then we could audit based on complaint from someone that, hey, it's not really occupied, even if they say it is. We could do random audits each year. And the fact that we had access to utility billings for each residence, which we could not make public, but we could use for this purpose from the utility companies. And then we imposed penalties if they did not pay or were late in their payments. So there was a real enforcement mechanism that we devised. Next. And then from the latest full year annual report, the 2024 report should be out very soon now, if it isn't already. We had about 200,000 properties that were required to declare whether they were or not. And really, the first year anyway, 1,000 units were declared vacant, which was about half of all the properties that were asked to declare. And so we did some additional investigation, and that percentage went up a bit that were vacant. But the good news is that as of 7 years into this program, about half of all the ones that were declared vacant have been occupied, and the remaining roughly 49%, excuse me, and the remaining half of that that were unoccupied, I should say, have paid their tax. So next. So here's just kind of the stream of revenue that's come between 2018, which was the first revenue year after 2017 adoption, and last year. So you can see about $300 million was raised. Now, if you scale that down to whatever the number is, 600, 800, 1,000 units in Clatsop County, but maybe lower values there, you're still ending up with millions of dollars over the time because many of these folks would just prefer to pay the tax. And there are various ways you can phase that in or grandfather in certain parties or whatever. There are ways you can devise local ordinances to not have the shock value in the very first year or even upon resale of the home where it's kind of priced in anyway, or could be. So just wanted to give you sort of that overview. So, take even 10 or 15% of that amount to scale it to Clatsop County. And you're ending with a stream of annual revenue that can, in our case, we uh, dedicated 100% of that revenue. There's a tiny bit that went to administrative collection staff to the Affordable Housing Fund that we created in Vancouver. And that then turned around and leveraged uh, investments by other, whether those were private or whether those were other governmental or foundation investments in affordable housing. So gave us a lot of oomph there, for a relatively discrete action. Next. And so I mentioned the housing fund. We also made sure that we really wanted to use that revenue from the empty homes tax to um, augment the city-owned land supply with development monies we had coming in that weren't allocated within those projects to support affordable housing offsite from those developments, uh, and a number of other things. We put together a $2 billion fund, that's a bunch of money or assets to deploy. So you could scale that down to Clatsop County sort of size, but you could create an ongoing affordable housing fund with the empty homes tax revenue and other pieces of land that are publicly owned, and then working with nonprofit housing groups, for example, to develop. So it's a very, very substantial long-term strategy. And this again was our 10-year strategy. And we arrived at this $2 billion fund fairly about halfway through that. So just think about the application in Clatsop County. Next. And here's roughly how we um, allocated 1 year's receipts, about 27 million. And there's still some more owed on top of the 27, but um, 15 million went to what we called CHIP grants, which were to basically um, acquire land or seed investments by others in building affordable housing. Um, a bunch went to programming out future projects and other partnerships, and then a chunk for a creation of enhancements and capital expenditures and things like that that we were finding all over the city. Well, this housing project could happen if it just had some infrastructure funding as well and things like that. So there's a way you can dedicate this entirely toward the housing, affordable housing purpose, but spend it in a bunch of different categories that actually add up over time. Next. So I think there are some implications for this for coastal communities because you have that graph I showed you earlier that came from Melissa's work that showed the amount of the huge proportion of what we were calling in Vancouver empty homes or partially occupied homes occupied a part of the year, and the short-term rental things. Just seems like a really rich discussion to have on the coast where you have so many people who are basically have second or vacation homes or short-term rentals or both. Next. And the last thing I just wanted to hit was this set of things, and there are others on the emerging on the horizon out there, are going to bring housing costs down or make housing much more quicker to develop or affordable or both. Um, and so keep your eye on this. Mass timber it's coming. In fact, Port of Portland just made an agreement with a huge mass timber manufacturer on a terminal two. And the costs are going to be coming down here. We experimented with it quite a bit in Vancouver and got everything in it. The nice thing is that in certain locations, for example, downtown Astoria, you could go to, you know, 8 to 12 stories if you wanted to with mass timber construction as opposed to steel and concrete, which is much more expensive, and the timber is more um, environmentally appropriate, and we got through all the fire requirements and stuff with the province of British Columbia. And so it's happening. It's happening fast. The other thing big happening on the horizon is prefabricated panels. So a lot of the building components are built off-site in enclosed spaces and then shipped to the site. So the building, once you get the structural framework up, goes up really fast, and it's high quality. and adaptable to a bunch of different unit types and sizes and designs. And then finally, modular units, like I talked about, which could be used for ordinary rentals. We target them primarily for homeless transition, but they could be used in any number of ways. And you're seeing that in a number of cities in Europe where things like the old shipping containers are being, repurposed, and the modular can be manufactured to specifications of any kind here in the States. So just wanted to leave you with that kind of thought as well. Next. I think that's it. So really this was meant for me to just tee up a conversation with you, not try to play the local expert, which you all are, and I'm not. But again, appreciate the invitation to come and engage you today.
Thank you, Gil. Certainly appreciate the perspective and the insight. I want to start off a couple of questions. I've got one myself, and as someone who's about to retire, I might be able to ask a tough question and not get into too much trouble. I'm guessing, just saying. So one of the things you talked about earlier on too is we should try to make things easier and look at our code and try to make development processes easier. Clatsop County just went through a fairly significant review of its code and relatively significantly changed some of our processes to make the development of land easier in areas where we have community sewer, community water, and we were immediately challenged, and it was taken to LUBA. And LUBA remanded it now, and so we're now in a position where we were doing some of that, and because of people not liking it in their neighborhood, it was appealed up. And so my question is, how do you balance that? I mean, certainly you don't want to take away people's rights to appeal, but we're trying to do the good thing here, and we're now back to a code that's 6 months old because of the appeal.
Yeah, so I don't know the detail there or how it's going to play out in the remand, but I'm curious as to whether the thrust of the appeal was around the lack of level of review on the part of neighbors, or whether it was a particular provision like parking or height or whatever they didn't like, because those are
Just
different.
in all honesty, it was a little bit of both. It was essentially, we don't want higher density near us.
Yeah.
And so we don't think you did a good enough job looking at stormwater. And so, but it was essentially a NIMBY appeal. And again, I'm saying this as someone who's leaving. I'm not representing any group or organization, but it's kind of hard to do the right thing when the first thing that happens is you turn around and get brought to LUBA.
Yeah, you filed your PERS benefit, hopefully.
Yes.
Well, Brett may have a perspective on this too. My sense is that a lot of the remands are correctable by procedural steps and good information. So if you made a big miss on the stormwater or whatever it happens to be, then maybe you got a complimentary effort you've got to make in terms of investing in that infrastructure. But it may just be that you didn't portray your thought process or your research adequately. So without knowing the detail, it's hard for me to say, but we've worked through, and I know 1,000 Friends has helped a number of cities and organizations work through those LUBA appeals, and we've been the appellant in some cases too. Brett, I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I don't have anything specific on this one. I mean, this is one where we didn't have any comments when I went through it. So I don't have any.
And fair, Gil, I apologize. It might be a little unfair for me to ask that of you, but what I was trying to get at is the communities are all trying to do the right thing here, and it just seems like we bump up against NIMBYism.
Yes. Well,
every time we try something.
Here are a couple things, and I mentioned in the sort of guiding principles the idea of good messaging, good dialogue, and good outreach. And that's really critical to take on the critics right off the bat. And really the grounding point for you and potentially for many of them is you're trying to provide housing options for people who want to live and work in your community. And here are the big gaps we're trying to address. And here are some of the tools we're contemplating, and here's some of the implications of that. And you may not like all the implications, but the big get here is that your kids are going to be able to live here, and they may not now. And that kind of honest conversation where you're not trying to do smoke and mirrors, but you're being very real with people is a big help. I would also say your preparation and testimony at LCDC or LUBA, excuse me, on appeal. Um, just be as articulate and compassionate as you can be and true to what the purpose is behind all this. And so if there are technical deficiencies that were cited in the remand, hit those straight on, but wrap those with why are we doing this and what's at stake. So those will be the two big things. I think developing good messaging around this is so important and reaching out and just meeting with people, even who are critics. The corollary to that is helping to organize people who need that housing badly. So, we worked with renters groups, we worked with young people in Vancouver, we worked with poor and immigrant people. And suddenly, after some organizing work there, they showed up at public hearings at the city council for project approvals, and it was overwhelming. The council suddenly wasn't just hearing from the good old NIMBY property owners who'd been there for, decades. They were hearing from a whole nother group of Astorians, for example, or seaside residents who said, I need this kind of housing, and I work here, and I want to raise a family here. And that completely changed the dynamics in the council meetings in Vancouver. And I watched it happen. And part of it was our work going out and organizing with others. But there was a tipping point where it just suddenly changed, and very dramatically. So it takes time and it takes effort other than just writing policy. Does that
I
make sense?
appreciate, yeah, it does. I appreciate your perspective on that. Any other questions from the group up either on TV or here? Go ahead.
So I guess a couple things come to mind. First off, as opposed to Vancouver or some of the other cities, we're a bunch of little cities, each with our own budgets, the county.
Yep.
So for instance, Warrenton's population is 6,000. We couldn't even do a high rise if we wanted to, because first off, we don't have a truck big enough to get there. Volunteer fire department, trucks would cost us too much money to even allow that to happen in our community. I applaud the idea, but it doesn't work in a community such as ours. I mean, by landmass, we're the fourth largest city in the state of Oregon, but there is a considerable amount of wetlands as well. So we deal with all that. And then, we also, a mix of homes. For instance, on Main Street today, I can tell you of horror homes that are sale right now under the $200,000 mark. Okay, they aren't getting anybody to buy them. And the reason they're not getting anybody to purchase those homes, to flip them to make them livable homes, is what it costs to update those homes and get them through codes. Considering the fact that some of these homes are 90, 80 years old, 100 years old, and still have asbestos siding on the side of the house. So the cost is so astronomical that even if a builder comes in and says, I'm going to buy this house for $150,000, and my spare time, I'm a realtor, but I've had people look at a home like that, but then when they go to see what it's going to cost to update the home, it's now in the 350. It's once again out of the pricing vote for most of the people who want to live there based upon where we live today. You couldn't even rent that home out for less than $2,500 a month. So based upon where housing sits in our community today. So unless there's some way that those homes can be somehow the builders or even the city can figure out a way to purchase those homes and find ways of developing and redeveloping those homes. I don't see anything happening with those properties. And the problem then goes to, of course, funding again. Where's a city of 6,000 people supposed to come up with those funds? Our problem isn't short-term rentals. I mean, we have less than a dozen in our community. Our problem isn't empty homes for people, because Warrenton is a community primarily of working class people who live in their community, who live in the homes. So I mean, it's just our biggest asset is the shopping district. Costco's and Walmart's, the Fred Meyers.
Right. No, I totally understand what you're saying. And a couple of responses. One is that many of the concepts I've put out are scalable, so they don't depend on big towers. And I was trying to say that up front. That said, I think just from looking at the information that was provided to me on the city profiles, Warrenton is quite different than, for example, Cannon Beach, right, in terms of its values and that kind of thing. So you've got kind of a unique situation in Warrenton. Prices will ultimately rise over time, and make those more attractive purchases and remodels. And there is some money being allocated in the governor's bill in the state legislature to assist communities financially with development of housing. The other piece I would just say is that, and I don't want to downplay your issue at all, because I think you're absolutely spot on. Your local knowledge is superior to mine for sure. But I think that to the extent that funds are available externally with some local developer funding or even a little piece of city funding to do Main Street rental housing, in a working class town, everybody wants to own their own home and have a single family home, but not everybody can afford to do that. And my sense is that there's a market for new rental, even in Warrenton. So you've got to be really strategic. And I know you can't turn things around overnight, given the economics of what you just said. But think about what are the things out of today's discussion you might be able to pick out and tailor make or build on. Because you're describing a tough situation. That's true of many towns in Oregon, and across the country. Whereas I think communities like Cannon Beach and Gearhart and Seaside are kind of in a different realm in terms of the economic and price pressures there.
Thank you, Gil. Jason, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to take a moment to make a comment. I actually have to leave to hop on another call at 3 o'clock, but I just wanted to say thank you, Gil. I really enjoyed the presentation and the discussion afterwards. I was a land use planner for the city of Grants Pass for 6 years. Now I'm on the financing side of the equation working for OHCS, but it was nice to kind of dive back into discussions around land use. So thank you for having me. I will see everybody at the next meeting, and thanks again, Gil.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. Any other questions here in the room? All right, here we go.
Steve from Cannon Beach. So we're obviously the ones with the second homes and the tax issue. And so you mentioned the aspect of utilizing the tax dollars for, you have significant land and significant probably blighted properties that you could choose to select to do affordable housing developments. We don't really have that aspect. So as you can see from the amount of money it costs for homes in Cannon Beach, taxes aren't an issue. We got money. But how can we effectively use a vacancy tax? Is it something that you set up a nonprofit and maybe purchase homes that come for sale and then have a nonprofit operate them for affordable rents? I know that we had some discussion, the mayor testified about what the use of the vacancy tax can be used for, and it was very limited, I believe, to developments.
That's a bill that died, so that
Okay.
rule is not gonna happen.
Okay.
So now cities and counties have home rule to do what they want.
Gotcha.
And I think that's a huge change. And I think just to get at your point, right,
First
you,
things first. Let's make it invested.
but you could dedicate tax revenue, and you're a perfect candidate as a city to impose some kind of empty homes tax, and regulate second units, as I think you already do, or excuse me, short-term rentals. But to apply that money to acquiring through, you can set up a nonprofit entity, or you could do it, form a city agency if you wanted to acquire existing land or homes as they become available and make those affordable. Because, with a stream of income that could come from your city tax dedicated to affordable housing, you could do a lot over time, a lot of purchasing. And if there are empty lots, even a smaller size where you cooperate with a developer who wants to do some amount of their own piece, but was willing to cooperate with you or the nonprofit to do affordable for some or all of that, I'd say it's flexible.
Okay, so it's an option. And then the other thing is we are trying to do some housing code amendments, and we're trying to do the public benefits aspect of we're reducing floor area ratios with a give back if you do public benefits, which would be to rent it to affordable, and correct me if I'm wrong on anything if you want to add. But if a person is willing to lease or own the home, then they would get certain buybacks or public benefits in terms of increase in floor area ratio. And then with our accessory dwelling units, that you wouldn't necessarily count that against the floor area ratio. We'll see what type of kind of reaction we'll get. But as far as like, I like your ideas as far as the downtown and not necessarily, no one in our community is going to approve additional height to our downtown. I shouldn't say no one, but I think it's slight to none. And so, to me, that's an ideal scenario of trying to get housing. But I think one of the things we run into is the concern about creating opportunities for additional second homes. And how do we best alleviate that with the incentives we're trying to provide?
Well, I think, you're right. And I think that in your case, the downtowns of Astoria and Seaside might be more amenable to some strategic height increases and so forth. Cannon Beach, it's tough. But just so you know, I feel like I grew up in Cannon Beach. I spent every summer there as a kid, from the day school got out till Labor Day evening.
Don't have a second home, do you?
No, but it was my grandmother's second home back, generations ago. So, but so I know the town well, and I know how limited development sites are. But I think your notion of teasing out affordability on very modest infill sites, or acquiring existing homes through an arm's length agency of the city, a nonprofit or whatever. I think that's a really clever approach. The other way again, is the demand side, tamping down the demand for second homes. The imposition of a vacancy tax is going to cool some of that demand. Some of that will look elsewhere. And your short-term rental policies, and I'm not familiar with the details of your policy there, is another way to kind of tamp down a portion of the demand. So you got to work many channels.
We can improve on our STRs, but we have a 14-day requirement, which is pretty restrictive. You can't just rent it for any day of the month. There's a certain period of time that you can do it. So, and like you're saying, on some of the taxes, some of the homes just aren't going, the people are just going to be like, we can afford the tax, like you said. But there are some smaller ones where maybe we could get them to, lease out or rent out, residentials or something.
Particularly if your tax helps, either through the floor area piece as an incentive, but also whether the taxes it accrues over time, some portion of that can be used as rent subsidy for qualified individuals, so that the owner there's not taking a big hit. So anyway, there are a number of ways to approach it. You kind of got to look at it from a bunch of different angles. I just I don't know if you have in your STR regulations, you have a limit on the number of days per year they can be rented out. Several cities have done.
We don't do that because in essence, the 14-day allows you twice a month to rent. In essence, you get 2 times a month practically to rent out, whether it's 1 day or 14 days.
But it could be all year long.
Yeah.
And what we did in San Francisco, for example, was limited to, I can't remember, we finally ended up at 90 or 120 days a year maximum you could do a short-term rental. So Um, anyway,
So
there's different ways to approach
the
it.
tax sounds real good, but what about the process, the fight, the getting from talking about it to doing it, time frame? You know, give us your story on that.
Well, I think the key message there is, the Vancouver was a bit of an exception because the audience who would most resist the imposition of the tax were mostly foreign buyers, not living there. So we had an easy road there. In Cannon Beach or many of the other cities, you need to be upfront with and engage those owners. And as I said, you've got some hip pocket backup alternatives. One is you could exempt current property owners and just apply it on the sale of property. So over time, it's slower, but it builds up over time. You could have a lower rate for long-term owners, or you could phase in the percentage of the tax against the assessed value over time. So there are ways to kind of ameliorate the hit. Again, there's no state regulation that's telling you what and how to do this. It's up to each city to sort of craft their own approach here. But I do think ultimately the empty homes tax could be quite a benefit to Cannon Beach and the other cities we've talked about, with a possible exception of Warrenton.
Other questions?
I have one.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Hey, Gil, I'm Jeff Ware. I'm from Seaside. I'm originally from the Upper Valley of the river, though.
Oh, okay.
That growth over the years, it's quite extravagant compared to what it was when I was younger.
Yeah.
Seaside's going through some pretty significant change with our comprehensive plan, and they're jumping into our development code as well. Looking at some of your concepts for infill is ideas we've sort of been discussing and how to create some redevelopment in our higher density core downtown area. If you traverse Seaside by foot, you'll see a lot of our downtown area. There's a lot of blight. That blight is also our lowest cost rental housing. So we're in a situation where these are not quality, or to some extent, probably not safe rental units, that if we spur redevelopment, it's going to displace a lot of people. The second part is for consideration is parking standards. As I was discussing with the group before the meeting started today, we've got one event this year. One of our many events this year is our volleyball tournament, and they're expecting over 40,000 participants in the tournament this year. Most of those are drive-to people, not fly-in. Almost all of them are drive-to. So when we start lowering parking standards off-street for residences or any other uses within the city, where do we put these influx of tourist cars that we get throughout the year? It may work in some areas. I don't know if that would necessarily work well with us because we do have such an influx in tourism. I mean, 40,000, our population is 7,300. 40,000 people for a 5-day period, 6-day period is a significant increase for us.
Yeah, yeah. That almost calls for a very specific strategy for that peak period that may have to have people walk a bit further or park further away, or I don't know if you have even permit parking downtown, but there are different ways to address that other than imposing high parking standards on new development. If I'm catching your drift, the disposition of existing or displacement of existing renters from those low quality but existing rental buildings, that's another real conundrum there. And I guess I would want to understand, what are they typically paying for rent now, and what would it cost in new rental units if there were a certain percentage of those that were guaranteed to be long-term affordable, so that you offset at least some of that pain and that burden. And we did a bunch of programs around helping people relocate, giving them first right of refusal in some cases where the rents were close. This is in Vancouver and San Francisco. A lot of counseling around what tenants' rights were, and often negotiating with the new development for a grace period or some rent supplement for several months while they went to find something new, and that kind of thing. So it gets complicated when you're talking about displacing people from existing rental housing, even where it's low quality and possibly not safe. I'd love to talk with you further because, the parking, I had parking listed on my thing as the conundrum, and it really is. It's very tough from
It's a
all
big
kinds
issue
of
for us.
standards.
And those exploration discussions of can we park out of town and shuttle in, there's really no land to do that on.
Yeah.
We have the same land constraints that Cannon Beach has, and that even Gerhardt to some extent has those
Yeah.
constraints. So that idea of being able to, I mean, we would love to find funding to go vertical with a large parking structure downtown that
Right.
couples as a tsunami evacuation tower. But again, we're talking financially much more money than the city can
Yeah,
build.
that's big. I mean, there's certain ways you approach that in terms of financing it with parking rates for the garage but it needs to be over a long period of time and you need to be able to bond for it and so forth. So it's a heavy lift. It's probably in your long-term interest to do that if you can figure out the financing scheme. And the same thing could happen in downtown Astoria. There are some lots where you could accommodate grouped parking and relieve that cost burden from housing development that could use those same lots for affordable housing. Because, structured parking is, boy, the cost of that going underground is really mushroomed over the last few years. Last night I checked in Vancouver, for example, which is a higher land value market. But construction costs aren't all that different than they are in down here in the States. They were creeping up on some sites to 75,000 a parking space. That used to be what homes were costing. So it's a real conundrum as you were pointing out. But at some point you got to take the big bite, I think, given those peak periods that you experience. You don't want to overbuild for every day of the year, right? You want to be able to handle that peak, and then you want to be able to consolidate some group parking in your central area, even if that means a long-term financing for a garage. I think.
Well, we are seeing those peak periods start to expand
Yeah.
past the shoulder seasons now. We're seeing heavy days, heavy loads during February, March, when traditionally before you wouldn't see
Uh-huh.
large crowds here in Seaside.
Yeah. Interesting. Huh.
Other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I'm just curious as to what you attribute that spread of the peak season to.
Lots of TLT money that can be used for tourist advertising. Our tourism,
Okay.
our tourism department specifically targets off-season
Yes.
Advertising because we don't need to advertise for summertime. I mean, as soon as school gets out, Seaside's time.
Right.
But I would say that coupled with, people have discovered that our weather is very nice here in October
Yeah.
and sometimes as far into November, and it starts getting nice around, end of February, March. And
Yeah.
you see people wanting to come here and then throw the COVID phenomenon on top of that, where fly to destinations, we're seeing kind of a decline, and drive to destinations we're reaching peaks that we've never seen before.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of people are traveling more to those drive to destinations in the off season.
Yeah. Interesting. Hmm.
Well, and your specific sports tournaments.
And sports tourism is now becoming huge for us as well.
Oh,
We
yeah.
have large basketball tournaments now in the wintertime that are attracting a lot of people.
Right. Good for the economy, but tough on the parking situation. Yeah.
If they can.
And,
Get
and
your
I-
reservations now.
Yeah, okay. Oh, and I know there's a big debate going on about the use of a hotel tax, lodging tax, about whether that can be used for supporting infrastructure for all these tourists that come into town. And
Yeah, our mayor has been fighting that fight for many years now.
It's very near and dear to the heart of a lot of the cities and the county, that issue of the flexibility on it. So,
yeah,
any other questions for Gil?
I've got one. It's hopefully a quick one. Not to bring it back to Cannon Beach problems, but we're
full of Cannon Beach
full of
problems.
Cannon Beach problems. So we're doing the code revision, the building code revision, and we're trying to incentivize 12-month rentals.
Mm-hmm.
But we're running into, I think, a problem around how we could enforce that, whether it's a deed restriction or really specifically to your point earlier, how we prevent condoization of, say,
Right.
second floors of commercial buildings where if someone needs to, get that the building investment back right away. They might just condoize and sell, which we then worry would be more second homes or second condos, if you will. But even with duplexes or other things, how can we enforce the renting to locals as opposed to becoming another vacation unit?
Well, I think there are a couple of pressures there. One is the short-term rental possibility of those. And you could basically cap the number of short-term rentals in your city to the existing number and only open up that window when one goes out of existence or out of business, right? So that's the best way to kind of cut that piece off. In terms of, you know, second homes that are not short-term rentals, but are not that are we would call empty homes. I guess if you're as a city, if you've got any skin in the game at all through an incentive program of any kind to help develop these other units, you can impose a deed restriction, just as part of the bargain. Say this cannot be. We will not approve a subdivision of this property to allow another ownership unit. It has to be rental. You can't force them to rent it out, but you can keep it as rental. And so the incentive for them will be to rent it out.
Good. And that deed restriction would pass from owner to owner because we had some
That's
confusion.
it runs with the land. It's up to you to lift it in the future if you ever want to. But if without that, it doesn't matter who the owner is. It runs with the land.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful.
I got a quick closing
Question
question.
in the back here.
Hey, Gil, John with City of Astoria. Twofold question, easy one. I don't think any jurisdiction in the state has been successful with an empty home tax. Maybe one has, or what jurisdiction has been closest to being successful with an empty home tax in Oregon?
I don't know of any personally. I know that we were kind of pioneering this nearly a decade ago in Vancouver in terms of Canada, and we scoured around in the US to find anything that came close to what we were talking about. We didn't find any. So we just decided, heck, we're going to try it and do it. And as I said, it hasn't been subject to legal challenge, and it's been quite successful, and it's fueled our uh, Affordable Housing Development Fund, so it's well received by the general public. But again, without having a legal challenge, it's hard to know. And we didn't really find any other precedents. There may have been some that have come along in the last 7 or 8 years since we started our program up there that I'm not aware of in the States. That'd be worth an investigation, but none came to in our view during our research, and none have popped up on my screen in the interim period. So, I just think it's such a ripe idea for communities that have high visitor populations and particularly second homes. Um, it's an idea whose time has come, so give it a try.
Did you have a second question, or was that it?
That was it, yeah. We just come close to you.
Yeah. All right. Well, Gil, we really do appreciate your knowledge and expertise and your time sharing it with us. We're hoping that this group continues to move forward with our work, and thanks for the insight.
Sure. Well, happy to come back anytime, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege and honor for me to engage with you, and I'd love to stay engaged with you and see how things go. And as I said, wearing my other hat for Thousand Friends and Jackie being here, she's already started to make some inroads in Astoria, and it'd be great for her to get to know you. And we've talked about maybe doing something akin to that housing competition that I mentioned that we did in Vancouver, which was quite successful. Love to find some communities throughout the state of Oregon, including the North Coast, that would be willing participants in something like that and would help us select some opportunity sites to get some designers and some real estate informed folks in to take a look at and gin up some options or some creative ideas that may actually get built. So.
Yeah, that would be so interesting. I think we do have some interest in having a conversation with Thousand Friends about that. Jackie, I don't know if you had anything you just wanted to add to the group.
I didn't have anything specific to add, but yes, I'm really excited to start getting to know folks in Astoria and Seaside, Cannon Beach, all of the locations. And yeah, I'm excited to work with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gil, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Anytime when Alyssa calls, I respond, so.
Don't hear that?
Yeah. Dinner's on her next time you're in town.
For sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. I'll be checking out now. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So we have just a few minutes left in our meeting today. Did you want to do a brief update on work that you've been doing in the last month?
Quick update on leads to locals. I want to thank cities of Seaside and Astoria for passing resolutions this week. I want to thank all the cities. All 5 of you guys have gotten me letters of support this week, and so that's actually huge. I want to thank CMH for their letter of support. We've gotten support letters from the Visitors Association, from our friends at Orla. We're getting support from the Realtors. Colpack sent us a letter. It hasn't been very hard to find support from partners in the community who really think this is a good idea. I'm submitting the grant application tomorrow. You always want to do it a couple days early, make sure the grant thing works, no issues. And so I'm rounding up my last bit of letters today. Because there's no program if we don't get the grant. So all efforts toward that is really the main thing. But then I'm also now working with Placemate on developing program guidelines. So how would this actually work? Many of the conversations I've had with each of the city councils have raised some key questions like how do we determine eligibility? And what about how this fits with the regulations that we already have in our city? And so that's kind of the next piece of work, is actually building out the program in a way that works. And your staff have already started weighing in on that. And thank you guys for your comments. And then should we get the grant, I will notify you all immediately. And I'm already working with the county in terms of procurement and contracting and the way we would actually set up a contract. The Board of Commissioners would have to, a $955,000 contract would have to go to our board, as you can imagine. And so we'll be working on that through the summer. The goal is still to try to roll it out in August, begin the marketing in August for an uptake in September, thinking about the shift in the seasons. And so this is something we'll be working on all summer. If any of you have thoughts or input or questions about the work, please feel free to reach out to me. Just also wanted to give you a quick update. Garrett Phillips and I from Gerhardt are working on the grant to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which we also talked about in terms of following up on the buildable land work with the development sites. That's a grant that's due next month, so I'm not worrying about it with this one. But Garrett and I have started working on a scope of work, and we'll want to talk to the cities about sites and next steps on that. So with that in mind, we have, a busy summer on these 2 projects and these 2 grants, and it's actually great to have this group helping guide it. One question that has come up is we often do not meet in July and or August because it's the summertime. And so the question that Garrett and I have for the group is, do you guys want to have meetings in July and August so that we can keep communicating about the work? Do we want to take 1 or 2 of those months off, rekindle ourselves in September? But we don't want to hold meetings if you guys aren't going to be here, or if it's not a good use of folks' time.
When we get the grant, I think we need a meeting.
Yes, I agree, so that we can talk about next steps for communication, marketing.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we get the grant, I like that. And so we won't cancel any meetings. We'll just wait and see what happens for next month. We have a whole month to decide. But wanted to get the group's feedback in terms of availability and interest. And I think with the DLCD grant, we might also want to have conversations as a group about making sure we're putting together the right scope of work. So it kind of leans toward we'll see each other this summer. But if anything comes up with any of you, please let us know. Those are all the updates I have. I don't know if anybody else has any updates or questions on
anything from people on TV or here in the group.
The 2 cities that passed the resolution, was there any opposition?
That was somebody else's money.
That's pretty much what
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
That's what every elected body is saying. Hey, we're not paying. Cool.
Ours will be on Tuesday.
Okay, and I'm happy to come make presentations as needed, or I feel like in Cannon Beach, you talked about it enough, but and I'll be doing our county board on July 9th as well, so the county will be doing it also.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order?
Right, Jay.
All right, I move we adjourn. Done.
Round of applause for Tina.
Thank you.
We'll drink that wine.